Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Reason Through podcast, a show dedicated to having charitable philosophical discussions, as well as helping you, the listener, develop and reason through your view. In this episode, I speak with Dr. Chris Ranalli. We speak on skepticism, but not in the everyday use of the word skepticism. The kind of skepticism that philosophers are interested in is called radical skepticism. Radical skepticism is about being skeptic about the external world, whether any belief is justified. This is the kind of skepticism that we are referring to. In this episode, we touch upon the history, its responses, and as well as some contemporary responses. In the beginning of the episode, I conduct a small interview with Dr. Ranalli. So if you'd like to skip straight to the topic, see the 8 to 10 minute mark. Without further ado, I bring you Dr. Chris Ranalli. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode. Today I have with me Dr. Chris Ranalli. Dr. Ranalli, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, really happy to be here.
Yeah, so before we get started in today's topic, if you don't mind telling our listeners who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm a researcher at the Free University in Amsterdam, and I'm an epistemologist, but I also do things like philosophy of mind and more recently the ethics of belief. So this is sort of where epistemology and ethics intersect. And I mainly have been researching more applied epistemological topics as of late, but I sort of started out doing more theoretical epistemology. So, for example, topics like skepticism, and then a bit later on, disagreement, reasonable disagreement, deep disagreement. And now I'm thinking about sort of the practical applications of skepticism, conspiracy theories, and more like epistemology of education. So, trying to figure out what's the difference between indoctrination and education. So sort of topics like that. So more sort of applied practical dimensions of epistemology.
Yeah, and they're definitely relatable too, right? It's like, because there's conspiracy theories that are out there, and kind of thinking about it. Like we were just talking about this kind of off camera about, like the COVID vaccine deniers, right? So they're expressing some type of skepticism towards, the vaccine, and that may be due to misinformation, probably is due to misinformation, but just, the skepticism kind of, in some way kind of permeates a little bit within our society. And I don't mean in a bad way. It's just, having doubt about things. So how did you get into philosophy?
So, I used to be a facilitator for the Amsterdam Socrates Cafe, and so this is sort of a weekly meetup group which has sort of like open philosophical discussions in a sort of Socratic style. And I was one of the facilitators for that for about maybe a little over a year. So I did that. And I guess in terms of my sort of academic history, so I'm from the United States. And you can probably just hear that I am. But I'm from New Jersey, but eventually I moved to Virginia, and I went to a sort of like a large state school, Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. And so initially I didn't even know what philosophy was, right? So I didn't have philosophy in my high school or anything like that. I really had no clue what it is. I thought maybe it's, related to classics, or perhaps it's related to poetry. I really just had no clear idea of what philosophy was. And I was originally registered as an anthropology student because I was just sort of, interested in the human condition, basically. And so one of the, university guidance counselors was like, well, it seems like you'd really like a philosophy course. Maybe you should take that. I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, maybe I should take that. So I did. And it was just a philosophy, sort of introduction to philosophy course. And it, goes through, metaphysics, some philosophy of religion, some epistemology, some ethics, some political philosophy, just sort of little tidbits of each. And I really loved the course. And I remember sort of after every lecture, I would just think about that, that day's topic, for the rest of the day. And I would like go to the library and like seek out like books, and like I remember like going through like the stacks and like going through like hardbound journals and be like, well, I really don't understand what any of this is saying, but it just is super cool to me. Um, so yeah, so I after that I then took an introduction to ethics course, and it was sort of the same thing happened there. And then so eventually I was like, well, all right, I think I'm going to change my major to philosophy because I just can't stop thinking about it. This is the thing I like to think about. This is the thing I like to talk about. Probably to, I mean, getting on everyone else's nerves, probably. But yeah, so once I discovered it, I was kind of hooked. A little bit of an addict. So I just tried to consume as much as I could of it, basically. Um,
Yeah, that's a little bit kind of like with a little like we're talking about like with my background as well. It's like kind of once I took an intro class, it feels like it happens that way where you're just thinking about it, and then and then at a certain point I'm just annoying my wife, right? Where I'm just like all these different topics about like with nature of free will, like do we have free will, do we not have free will? Uh, does God exist? Does God not exist? And so yeah, I am totally with you. Where like these topics, like I love talking about this, I love thinking about it, and yeah. Right there with you now.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And then, yeah, by the time I got to, I guess it must have been my second year, yeah, I got really sort of interested in sort of uh, like early analytical philosophy and British philosophy, and I had never been abroad yet either. So, yeah, I thought, yeah, maybe I should go study abroad. So I sort of looked at the list of schools that we had a relationship with, and I wasn't sort of sure about them like philosophically in terms of their philosophy departments. And then um, our head of department, he was a so he's British, and then so that sort of inspired me also to look for like a British school to go to. And then so I found the University of Edinburgh. So I went and studied there for a semester, which actually turned into a year because I liked it so much. And then once I came home, I was like, okay, so I want to try to hurry up and finish this bachelor's degree so I can kind of go back and go to graduate school. And that's exactly what I did. So I went and did my PhD at the University of Edinburgh. Um, and yeah, I mean, I worked on skepticism for my PhD thesis. And yeah, since then I've sort of gone all over the place. I went to Mexico right after my PhD for a postdoc fellowship, and then I did a Humboldt fellowship in Germany uh, before coming here to the Free University of Amsterdam.
Yeah, so you've been ever since you went abroad. I mean, just traveling. Is that something that you kind of started wanting to do, like just traveling, or just kind of just did it just how that's just how it worked out in that way?
Yeah, yeah, a little bit of both. So I, initially I really, really wanted to travel and just also just get to know other
Mhm.
cultures and meet new people and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, so I mean, yeah, so I sort of found out I had this postdoc in Mexico, sort of even before I had my PhD viva, which is
Mhm.
this sort of like oral defense of the PhD thesis. And then so I was really pretty psyched on that because I'd never been, well, I'd never been to Mexico. I hadn't been, so it was in Mexico City,
Mhm.
and I didn't really know anything about it except perhaps some of like the horror stories you get from like the U.S. media at the time. But when I was actually living there, I was like, "Whoa, this place is really pretty amazing. Like people are super nice, really welcoming, really friendly. Food's amazing. Weather is great.
Mhm.
The city is, yeah, I mean, the city is wonderful actually, and it's sort of surrounded by mountains, and yeah, it was a really incredible place, I have to say. And yeah, so when I was there, I just got a little bit more into some topics that are related to skepticism, but sort of go in slightly different, more social directions. So I got into like disagreement and deep disagreement. So it's not unrelated, but
Mhm.
just getting a little bit more social, slightly less pure epistemology. And then, Yeah, but I mean, ultimately, I really wanted to return to Europe. So,
Mm,
and then so that's what happened after that. So
yeah.
yeah,
So how long have you been living in Amsterdam?
yeah. Let's see now. I think oof, maybe it's like 3.5 years. I think
Okay. Yeah.
maybe slightly less, but around 3.5 years. Yeah.
Okay. Is this a place that you're probably gonna you feel like you're how do I word this? Stay the rest of your stay the rest of your life, or do you plan on traveling to a different? Because you mentioned like you want to stay in Europe, and so is Amsterdam the kind of like your resting place?
Well, I'm pretty open-minded about the EU in
Hmm.
general. So, yeah, I mean, one thing is my wife is from Germany, so we're somewhat more incentivized to go to a German-speaking country, but
Mm-hmm.
uh, this is also like a really wonderful place. So, I mean, I would be happy with here or
Hmm.
uh, yeah, a neighboring EU country would be fine. But generally speaking, the preference is for the European Union. Yeah.
Very cool. All right. So I
Yeah.
think this is a good segue into our topic, which is we've been talking about it a little bit, but skepticism. So yeah, what is skepticism? What are the kinds that kind of traditionally kind of classical skepticism, and then kind of how does it look like pretty much now? Yeah, how does that look? So.
Yeah, so the kind of skepticism that interests philosophers tends to be fairly radical. And by radical, I mean it has a pretty expansive scope. So, for example, what interests epistemologists are things like skepticism about the external world, or skepticism about other minds, skepticism about knowledge of the future or knowledge of the past. So those are sort of like more domain specific. Also, of course, skepticism about moral knowledge. But I guess it's worth saying though that this kind of skepticism isn't really the sort of skepticism that perhaps like non-philosophers or sort of laypersons. It's not really how they think about it. So I think if you take a look at something like the Skeptic Society or Skeptic Magazine and so on, skepticism in a kind of like popular sense means something like being suspicious of supernatural claims and being suspicious or doubtful of superstition and sort of standing against pseudoscience and promoting naturalism
Hmm.
and the scientific method.
Hmm.
Um, while epistemologists sort of are interested in that, it's not really the kind of skepticism that they are typically engaging with. They're engaging with sort of like more radical forms of skepticism, like usually certain sorts of skepticisms that those sort of popular skeptics would never endorse.
Yeah.
Frankly,
So just to kind of recap a little bit, so you're making a distinction between kind of a local skepticism, which is or moderate skepticism, right? Where you hear something happen and you're like, that sounds a little far fetched. You need a little bit more information before you believe some type of claim or something like that. As opposed to this radical skepticism, right? That's like, well, how do I know that I exist? How do we know that anything exists? Um, how do I know that other minds exist? Am I really touching a cup here? Am I really having a conversation? It kind of reminds me of like, could everything be an illusion? This is the kind of radical skepticism that we're referring to.
yeah, absolutely. So arguably, skepticism is sort of part of the very root of uh, the type of philosophy that goes back to ancient Greece. Um, I mean, arguably, and I know far less about this, but you can also find radical forms of skepticism in classical Indian philosophy. You can also find radical forms of skepticism in classical Chinese philosophy. So one could argue that if you just look at philosophy from a sort of like global historical perspective, you'll find skepticism sort of in all of the different traditions of philosophy. But the one I'm most familiar with is the kind that goes back to ancient Greece, and to some extent, you might think of Plato as a kind of proto skeptic, because sort of at least well, one way of thinking about Plato is that um, what you sort of the realm of knowledge is the realm of forms, which are these sort of like abstract perfect entities, right? And the physical world is sort of a mere shadow or a kind of just an appearance of this more perfect world. So to that extent, there's even a kind of skepticism latent in Plato's philosophy, and also some of the pre-Socratic philosophies. So consider Parmenides. So Parmenides was a metaphysical monist, so he believed there's exactly one thing, but that seems to be in tension with our everyday experience, right? So if you just look around you, it certainly seems like there's more than one thing. So um, insofar as you're someone like Parmenides, then it seems like you're also committed to a kind of skepticism with respect to the senses. So, like I said, going back to sort of classical Greek philosophy, yes, skepticism is definitely a part of that tradition. Um, but perhaps what skepticism is sort of well, perhaps the sorts of philosophers that are most associated with skepticism in sort of ancient Greek philosophy are the Pyrrhonians. So the Pyrrhonians, uh, like many of their contemporaries, they were sort of interested in what it takes to lead a good life, and so the Pyrrhonians thought that on their quest to discover what it takes to live a good life, they sort of thought they discovered, like, well, by suspending judgment on theoretical disputes, by suspending judgment about the nature of things, you can reach a state of undisturbedness or tranquility. And so for them, suspension of judgment with respect to sort of all theoretical claims was the way to go if you wanted to achieve the state of undisturbedness, the state of tranquility. So skepticism is definitely associated with these Pyrrhonian philosophers. Um, and then from there, I'm sorry, I'm just kind of skipping a lot of history, but
Yeah.
um, the sort of main kind of skepticism that um, contemporary epistemologists like to think about really has its origins in early modern philosophy. So the kind of skepticism that goes back to Descartes and David Hume, so those two in particular. So Descartes was sort of his project in the Meditations was not really a skeptical project, but really a kind of ambitious truth-seeking and knowledge-seeking project. But when philosophers talk about the Cartesian skeptical argument, they're talking about the arguments that Descartes, initially frames at the beginning of the Meditations when he talks about the dreaming hypothesis and the evil demon hypothesis. So those two hypotheses are sort of one of the basic constituents of what contemporary epistemologists call the radical skeptical paradox.
So essentially, kind of what we're talking about a little bit, and what you're highlighting is, at least with contemporary skepticism, we're talking about kind of skepticism in the form of how do we know that the external world exists?
That's right.
And kind of we could, and so essentially, kind of like with Descartes, his evil demon hypothesis, right? Where we could be essentially like there's a god or an evil demon that's just making things appear to be this way, and we can't really rule that out, I guess. And so in theory, I guess, off of this hypothesis that if everything can be an illusion, then how can we really have a foundation of, or believing that the external world exists? Is that something kind of on the lines of like what that would mean for us, I guess, for people? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's helpful. So what you said is correct. It is helpful, however, just to back up a little bit, because what's sort of interesting about this time period is that a lot of these sort of early modern philosophers, they had sort of a separation between sort of like what goes on in the mind and what goes on outside the mind. So um, philosophers like Descartes and David Hume, for example, and also arguably John Locke. So they thought that when you perceive an ordinary object in the world around you, so like a tree or a glass, what's actually going on is not that you're immediately aware of the tree or the glass, but you're actually aware of something internal, something sort of in the mind. And this thing in the mind they would call in like an image or a representation or an idea. They don't mean idea sort of in the sense that we do today, where we just mean something like, "Oh yeah, I have an idea about that," or a concept or something like that. But they mean something like a visual image or an auditory impression, or a cluster of such impressions. And then so they thought like, well, if what we strictly speaking perceive, right, immediately, if what we're immediately aware of in with respect to our sensory awareness are these sort of sensory impressions, that raises the question of whether the sensory impressions accurately represent or accurately reflect the things in the world around us. And it gets even more extreme, right? Because once you have this distinction between all the stuff you're aware of on the one hand, all the stuff you're immediately aware of on the one hand, and everything else, there's a deeper skeptical worry gets raised. Like, well, how do I know that the one accurately reflects the other? Couldn't it just be that I'm spontaneously conjuring up
Hmm.
all the sensory impressions? Um, right. So that was just thinking about the nature of cognition and perception
Yeah.
was already sort of enough
Yeah.
to raise this sort of skeptical worry about the external world.
So to bring it, I guess, back to like modern day, it reminds me of essentially like the Matrix, right? So in
Yeah.
theory, like we could be in a simulation, and we can't distinguish between things how they really are, and just all we're seeing are representations or things how they appear to be. And so it reminds me of like that in that way, where for all we know, we could be in the Matrix and everything is just simulated. And for like Neo, right, he's not seeing the code, he's
Right.
seeing the cup, you know. He's using his senses to justify why there's an object there. But the radical skepticism is calling into question, like, how can we really trust our senses to accurately, if they're if we're accurately perceiving something when we could be in a simulation and something else is really going on.
Yeah. So that's actually sort of exactly how contemporary epistemologists frame the radical skeptical problem. So it's basically something like this. It's at least possible that we could be in a matrix style scenario where you have all the present experiences and thoughts that you have now, but rather than the sorts of ordinary objects that you believe in causing those things to come about, it could be something radically different. So it could be this simulation. It could be, say, something that you can't even conceive of, or it could be, something like Descartes' evil demon. But the basic uh, point is just that since there's this gap between sensory impressions and the reality that stands behind those impressions, it's at least always possible that there's something else causing the sensory impressions that is different from what you take it to be. So it could be that although I take this cup to be causing my experience as of the cup, it could be something else. It could be something purely in my brain. Could be a simulate. It could be you know, the simulation, or it could be Descartes' demon. So something like that. And this is like what we call radical skeptical hypotheses. The radical skeptical hypotheses, they are incompatible with what we think we know, but
Hmm.
they're at the same time, they seem to be compatible with all the evidence that we have. So, if I think of my evidence that there's a cup in front of me right now, or that there's a computer in front of me right now, well, I'll refer to my sensory experience, namely my visual impression of the cup or my visual impression of the computer. But it seems like I could have that very visual impression, even if I were in a simulation, or
Hmm.
even if I were merely a bodiless brain in a vat hooked up to a simulation, right? Or even it, or even if Descartes' evil demon were causing that to happen in my mind.
Hmm.
Um, so radical skeptical hypotheses have these two features. They seem to be incompatible with your knowledge or what you take yourself to know at any rate, but they also seem to be compatible with all the evidence you have, and that's what makes them so worrying.
So, and this is kind of your highlighting, I guess, what would be called like the radical skeptical paradox, right? Because just kind of recap and make sure I'm understanding this right. So, right now, as far as like the way that radical skepticism is kind of produced, it's not saying that we are in fact in a brain intervat or we're in the matrix or simulation. All it is saying is that if it's a possibility, that's all it takes to get off the table. And that
Right.
seems to be, and because we can't necessarily rule that out, that comes in conflict with things that we believe we know, right? Like G.E. Moore would say, like, right, like I know that I have a right hand, or I know I have a hand. There's also this, what he would call like this closure principle, if I'm following that right, where it's like, I know A, then I know B, like I know A, therefore I know B, in that kind of syllogistic way. You have three things. One is there's a possibility that we're being in a simulation, but then we also believe that we know certain things. And because of this closure principle, like if I know this, then I know that, but we can't rule out uh, that we're in a brain in a vat. That there's something in there. There's this paradox where all those things kind of become in conflict with each other. Is that right? Am I? Is that?
Yeah, that is right. So we can yeah, so one reason to think about the radical skeptical problem in terms of a paradox is that first of all, it kind of brings out um, the fact that we seem to be committed to some individually plausible theses. Namely, the first thesis would be something like that you have ordinary knowledge of the world around you. So, for example, you know that you have a body, or that you know that you have hands, or that there's probably cars nearby, or something like that. But it also seems as if you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat. That is, you don't know that one of these radical skeptical hypotheses, doesn't really obtain. Okay, but it also seems as if you were to know that you have a hand, then you would thereby be able to know that, say, you're not a handless brain in a vat. So the thing is each one of these claims seems, at first sight, quite plausible, but when they're taken together, we have a contradiction, right? It can't be true. So all three of them can't be true together. It can't be true, that I know that I have a hand, and that if I know that I have a hand, then I know that I'm not a brain in a vat, but also that I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. Those three seem to be uh, logically contradictory, right? Um, so this radical skeptical paradox is like, well, how do we solve that, right? Which one of these three are false or otherwise not properly supported? And what makes it sort of a worrying paradox, at least at the sort of theoretical level, is that, well, each one of them seems intuitively plausible. You might even argue that each one of them seems to be quite commonsensical, so that, if they really are jointly incompatible with each other, then we have to actually give up something really intuitive, or something perhaps even commonsensical. And then so that sort of reveals, something bad about human reason, right? So that's really the deep skeptical worry here.
Yeah. So I have a couple questions. It just seems plausible to me that, like, so for example, like my daughter,
Mm.
and even me, until I started reading philosophy a little bit more about skepticism, it's just almost, for one, I guess it seems like to be taken for granted. Like, how do we not know the external world exists? Like it just seems so obvious that I'm not the only one in this world, or that there's a cup in front of me,
Right.
and like this commonsensical thing. So, do you find that some students kind of share, or most, I guess most people, most students that you come in contact with have that kind of intuition where it's like, yeah, well, of course this world exists. Like, what do you? It's kind of weird that this is even a problem. So yeah, that's one question, and then the second one is we like to moving on to how have philosophers try to grapple with kind of this paradox.
Yeah, yeah. So no, that's great. So on the first question, um, usually my students have sort of a shoulder shrugging response. So they're like, yeah, but of course I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, but so what? I mean, like, I don't have any reason to think I might be a brain in a vat, right? I don't have any reason to think that there might not be external objects. And then so one thing I say to them to try to get them to come around and appreciate the thought experiment and appreciate the paradox a little bit more is I said, like, well, we don't have to make it about knowledge. And, we can even grant, like, sure, maybe you can't be absolutely certain about anything, but knowledge is weaker than certainty, right? So you might know that, say, there's I don't know, a car outside without being absolutely certain that there's a car outside, right? So knowledge doesn't entail or doesn't seem to entail absolute certainty. Um, so first, I try to distinguish between certainty and knowledge. So maybe losing certainty isn't so bad, but losing knowledge seems a little bit worse. But we can also reframe the skeptical paradox so that's not even about knowledge, but also just about having good reason to believe what you do. So we can reframe it like this: well, it seems like you have good reason uh, to believe that you have hands, right? That seems like the reasonable thing to believe. But it also seems reasonable that if it's reasonable for you to think you have hands, then it's also reasonable to think that you're not merely a handless brain in a vat. And it also seems reasonable to think that, well, you don't have enough evidence to rule out that you're not a handless brain in a vat, right? So it would be sort of unreasonable to hold that, oh yeah, just my evidence just reveals to me that I'm not a handless brain in a vat, right? So that seems unreasonable. Um, so I think once we put the paradox this way, where we're thinking about epistemic reasons or what we have justification to believe, it becomes a little bit more pressing, right? And then you can even use the paradox to get rid of beliefs that actually matter to them, right? So, for example, it might be that someone has like a loving partner or a spouse. Everyone has family, and they go, well, look, just replace hand with your partner or your family. And it would turn out that, well, you have reason to believe that you have a family, but do you have reason to believe you're not a brain in a vat? Well, if not, then it looks like you don't have good reason to believe that you have a family after all. But then that seems like a really bad consequence, right? If you had to say suspend judgment on whether or not you have a family, right? That seems like a terrible a terrible attitude to have. So once I start framing the puzzle in this way, it starts to have a little bit more bite, I
Mm-hmm.
think.
So it's kind of what you're saying is that you don't even have to even have the knowledge. Like, I don't have to know something. It's essentially what the paradox is trying to demonstrate is that even just your beliefs, in fact, if they're indistinguishable between a simulated object and a real world object, and they're indistinguishable between each other, essentially what it sounds like is like all beliefs that you have would be therefore just unjustified. Like, you wouldn't have any good justification, or any justification, I should say, to believe one over the other. And so that calls into question everything, not just knowledge, but just every belief. I think is that kind of like what you mean, or kind of what we're kind of going with, yeah.
Yeah. So perhaps, yeah. Just to reiterate, yeah, the idea is that if I don't have strong enough justification for thinking I'm not a bodiless brain in a vat, then it looks as if I also don't have strong enough justification for thinking that I have a body, or that I have a family, or that I live in a city, and so on and so forth. Um, and sort of the linking principle here would be something like, if I have justification to believe one sort of belief, say that I have a body, then I would also have justification for believing that I'm not merely a bodiless brain in a vat. And so this links up with what you said earlier, where the more general principle linking these two ideas is something like, well, if I have justification to believe some proposition P, and I have justification to believe that that proposition implies another one, Q, then I get some justification to believe that Q as well. And then so we just plug in the ordinary belief and the skeptical hypothesis as follows. I have justification, it seems, to believe that I have a body. It seems like I have justification to believe that if I have a body, then I'm not merely a bodiless brain in a vat. So I ought to have justification to believe I'm not merely a bodiless brain in a vat. But that's precisely what it seems like I don't have. So that's the problem.
Right. So how have kind of philosophers have grappled with kind of responding to this paradox?
So if we think about it in terms of this inconsistent triad where I know or have justification to believe I have hands, and I know or have justification to believe, if I have hands, then I'm not a handless brain in a vat, but also I don't know or I don't have enough justification to think I'm not a brain in a vat. Morians, they hold uh, the first two parts of the trilemma. I know or have good reason to believe I have hands, and that if I do, then I'm not a brain in a vat. And so they end up rejecting the idea that you don't know or don't have good enough justification to think you're not a brain in a vat. So that's the element they get rid of. The other anti-skeptical position here is sometimes, well, it gets divided between what gets called the relevant alternatives view and also contextualism. So relevant alternatives theorists, they say that, well, it can happen that you know that you have hands, even if you don't know you're not a handless brain in a vat. So that can happen. Contextualists hold something like this. Sometimes you know you have hands, and thereby you're in a position to know you're not a handless brain in a vat, and other times you don't. And the reason why that is because the standards for knowledge shift with the context. So they think that in something like an epistemology class, where this radical skeptical paradox gets raised and you're actually discussing these radical skeptical hypotheses, they think that you are not then in a position to know that you're not a brain in a vat, right? So then they think, oh, so then in that case, you don't know that you have hands either. So if you're sitting in an epistemology class, you don't know that you're sitting in an epistemology class effectively. But as soon as you're, say, like at the grocery store or at the stoplight, you're now in a position to know that you're in the grocery store or at the stoplight because the standards for knowledge have changed. So it'll shift on the context, shift depending on what the context is. And then so we can talk about each reply.
Yeah. So let's go. Yeah, let's start with Moore. So I think Moore kind of took more of a commonsensical approach to ruling out this radical skepticism. And I think with Moore also, so I want to hear what you think about this. I think his approach was common sense in the way that's like, well, here are my hands, like they exist, therefore the external world exists. So with him though, I think he also made claims, or not, maybe not claims, but also spoke on that if our philosophical maybe argumentation or our philosophical inquiry kind of leads us to either contradict, I guess, or just be inconsistent with our common sense notions of things, then we should reject the philosophical I guess, inquiry on that and go with common sense. I think is that something that kind of what he was kind of going with on that?
Yeah, so there's definitely something like a Morean methodology in epistemology and metaphysics, perhaps even more so. So Morean methodology is something like this. You start off with common sense, and then you draw philosophically robust conclusions from that. So for example, there's in metaphysics especially, there's lots of positions which seem to be in tension with common sense. So there's the position that composite material objects don't exist. So this is called mereological nihilism. So it's a view that there's no object composes another. So there would be nothing like a table, nothing like a car, nothing like a computer. All such composite macro physical objects. They just don't exist. And then so the Morian here would say like, well, look, I mean, clearly, like there's tables and chairs, right? So um, if that's incompatible with Mariological nihilism, then it's Mariological nihilism, this piece of philosophical theory that has to go. So you can think of it as sort of like a modus, um sort of a modus ponens, just sort of deduction, right? Which is like, well, there are tables and chairs. If there are tables and chairs, then this philosophical theory, which says there isn't, that theory is false. So that philosophical theory is false. That's the basic template of the Morian methodology. Applied to epistemology, applied to the case of skepticism, it goes like this. It's like, well, I know that I have hands, and if I know that I have hands, then I know that I'm not a handless brain in a vat. So now I can deduce that I'm not a handless brain in a vat. So the idea is there's these two premises. First premise, I know I have hands. Second premise, if I know I have hands, then I know that I'm not a handless brain in a vat. And now I can deduce, right? I can just deduce that I'm not a handless brain in a vat. And so the Morian sort of challenges the non-Morian to go, okay, well, what's wrong with this deduction, right? I mean, deduction is a way of extending our knowledge, right? And it does seem, fairly commonsensical to think you have hands, and that if you do, right, then you're at least in a position to draw the consequence that you're not a handless brain in a vat, right? So that's sort of like the Morian's challenge um, to skeptics. Um, yeah, I mean, so what's interesting about Moore's argument is that it is itself kind of paradoxical, and that's because it seems sort of incredible that you can just know, that you're not a handless brain in a vat just by deducing it from something like, your alleged knowledge that you have hands or that you have a body. I should say that this argument, as I framed it, is really the neo-Morian argument. Moore's original argument, one he gave, he read a paper to the British Academy. It seemed to be targeting more or less the idealist rather than the skeptic. So the skeptic thinks that even if there's an external world, you don't know anything about it. The idealist, on the other hand, denies that there is an external world. So the idealist thinks that, everything is actually mind dependent. That is, everything really exists within a mind. So they think, if a table exists, then it's really something mental. So Moore's proof, as it gets called, is it tries to refute that view. And he argued like this: well, here is one hand and here is another. If that's the case, then there really are things that exist outside of me. That is, there really are external objects. So he took that as a refutation of idealism. But in some other writings, he sort of gave a similar kind of argument against skepticism, and that kind of argument is what contemporary Morians, or so-called neo-Morians, that's what they defend against radical skeptics.
So, kind of going back, when it comes to that, there seems to be, I think the way you've worded it is like there's a transmission failure when it comes to kind of the Morian response, meaning kind of like, does it, I guess the way I interpret it is like, does really like, there's, I think you worded it in the sense like, do these reasons that they don't really seem to support like the conclusion that there is an external world. So I guess to the radical skeptic, they find Moore's response kind of really unsatisfying, satisfying to kind of our commonsensical, I guess, what his common sense response.
Yeah. So earlier I said Moore's proof or Moore's argument seems itself to be paradoxical because, on the one hand, it seems commonsensical to think that you know that you have hands or know that you have a body, for example, but it also seems incredible to think that you can prove that there's an external world on the basis of something like that. And so one way of diagnosing why more proof seems so paradoxical, as it were, is to say something like, well, the reasons you have to believe the premise that you have hands, those reasons are not themselves reasons to think that there's an external world. So they don't transmit justification from premise to conclusion. It's a bit of an abstract idea, but um, yeah, perhaps to get a hold on it, think of it like this. So, there's things that we recognize uh, that have logical implications that we know about, right? So, it's a logical implication of, say, you're seeing a zebra at the moment, that you're not merely seeing a cleverly disguised mule at the same moment, right? So because a zebra can't be also a cleverly disguised mule. So that's a logical implication, right? Like if your belief that there's a zebra there is true, then it logically follows that there's not merely a cleverly disguised mule there that you're seeing instead. But it also seems as if the reasons you have for believing that there is a zebra there are not themselves reasons which tell against the animals being a cleverly disguised mule. Why? Well, because they would look just the same, right? Like they're indiscriminable from each other, right? So, I mean, just to sort of imagine such a scenario, I mean, take yourself to be at a zoo and you take yourself to be seeing a zebra. I mean, the enclosure says zebra and all of that. And then if your friend were to raise this sort of cleverly disguised mule hypothesis, I mean, it would be weird if you said, well, look, I mean, I can just see that it's not a cleverly disguised mule. No, that's not the kind of thing you can see, right? so so that's one of the ideas, one of the motivations behind transmission failure, which is like, well, it recognizes that you have these visual reasons, right? Visual justification for thinking there's a zebra there, but you certainly don't have visual justification for thinking that there's not a cleverly disguised mule made to look exactly like a zebra there. And then so that's you can sort of import that into Moore's argument, right? Well, he has these sensory, these visual and proprioception reasons to think that he has hands, but those perceptual reasons don't tell against the idealist view, right? It doesn't tell against that, and if it doesn't tell against that, then they're not really reasons for believing that there is an external world after all. That's what proponents of this transmission failure say.
Yeah, perfect. So then, kind of moving on from more, then you offered there was another response. There are other responses, such as kind of the contextualist responses to um, the paradox. And I think the way you framed it is that the way the contextualist is responding to the paradox is that the knowledge is shifting between our everyday kind of sense of how we're using knowledge versus kind of this certainty that is being required for this paradox.
Yeah, so if we're unsatisfied with the Morean response to the radical skeptical paradox, what comes next? Well, one thing that comes next is to question the idea that if you really do know that you have hands, then you have to be in a position to know you're not a handless brain in a vat, right? So the relevant alternatives theorists, they basically say like, well, the possibility that you're a brain in a vat just isn't relevant, right? So it's not one of the possibilities you need to eliminate in order to know that you have hands. There might be other possibilities you need to eliminate, but that's just not one of them because it's too far-fetched or too outlandish or too improbable, um, something like that. And usually with students, I find that this has a lot of intuitive appeal, right? Because they think, well, look, yeah, I don't know, I'm not a brain in a vat, but why would I need to be able to know that I'm not a brain in a vat just in order to know that I'm sitting here in this class? for example, right? So there is actually a lot of intuitive appeal there. What you said is getting closer to contextualism. So you might think that so according to contextualists, the standards for knowledge, they shift with the conversational context. So in a sort of a low standards context, which would pretty much be most everyday scenarios, you don't need to be able to rule out radical skeptical hypotheses in order to know things. But there are some high standard scenarios where you do need to be able to rule out skeptical hypotheses. And they think that in those cases, you actually can't do that. So, in a way, they sort of, depending on the context, they switch sides. In some contexts, they're anti skeptics, and in some contexts, they're skeptics. They just think that it's the nature of knowledge that forces us to switch teams like that. Um, yeah, I guess maybe one way of understanding contextualism, so that it's like a little bit more intuitive, or like, not looking ad hoc, is something like, well, imagine you're interested in finding out whether your fridge is empty or not. Maybe you're about to move, so you want to like empty everything out of the fridge. You open it up, right? And you're like, okay, well, there's no food in here, there's no beverages in here, there's no more ice, it's empty. Um, but now imagine the kind of the sense of empty that a physicist might have in mind when they're conducting, say, an experiment and they want to create a vacuum. And they go, okay, is this chamber empty? Right? Well, I mean, if what they're interested in here is like, well, it has to be just, empty in a different sense, right? It's like a higher standard for empty than the standard you had for, for it to be true that your fridge is empty. And other concepts work like this too, like flat. So if you're interested in playing a pool game, what it takes for a pool table to be flat might not be what it takes for a surface to count as flat for a physics experiment, right? It might have to be an absolutely frictionless surface, right, for the physicist. But obviously, that standard of flatness doesn't have to be realized in order for you to have a fair pool game, right? It just has to have no big bumps in the pool table and so on.
So something that's even very, I think, relevant now is I look at, and so it's interesting because I feel like the contextualist has there's a certain appeal to it, right? To where sometimes it does depend on the context of things. An example would be like the vaccinations, right? And COVID vaccine, to where you have, in general, no one questions the flu vaccination in the way that people are questioning the COVID vaccination right now. So like, and you see the context, right, switch between, at least I've seen the context switch where no one's calling it a question that it's, it's not, there's a microchip in it, all the kind of conspiratorial theories that are behind what's going on within the vaccination with the flu vaccine. So you have a certain standard of knowledge there where it's like, well, like, of course it's not there, like it's acceptable. But with the COVID vaccine, it's like, well, do you really know how can we really roll out these things to where the context of knowledge at that point is requiring the certainty behind it? What the contextualist is saying is like, well, there's a shift in standard. And at least from where I'm looking at it, in the sense like, well, yeah, why should we accept this standard for this one? I don't see any reason to accept that standard where we don't need to have certainty, doesn't even seem to be relevant.
Yeah, well, so I think the relevant alternatives view is pretty plausible. So just to talk about this first and then contextualism after that. I guess the main problem with it, I think, is that if it's correct, it seems like this principle we talked about earlier has to go. So the principle we talked about earlier gets called the closure principle. And it goes like this: if you know a proposition P and you know P entails Q, then you're also in a position to know that Q. And you can also replace knowledge with justification here. So if you're justified in believing that P and you're justified in believing that P entails Q, then you have some justification to believe that Q as well. So this is like a pretty intuitive principle because, I mean, you can just sort of see this by reflecting on cases, right? So if I have justification to think that it's nighttime right now, it seems like, then I also have some justification to think that it's not daytime right now, right? I recognize that if it's daytime right now here, then it's also not nighttime right now here. So if I have justification for the one, then I also get justification for the other. And you can just, plug in, so other plausible propositions, and to sort of like, make it look like, well, this principle is just something we can't give up, right? I mean, or how about this? Like, if I have justification to think I'm in Amsterdam right now, but if I'm in Amsterdam right now, then I'm not in Los Angeles right now. So if I really do have justification to think I'm in Amsterdam right now, then I also have justification to think that I'm not presently in Los Angeles right now, right? Like, how could it be that I have justification to think I'm in Amsterdam, uh, but I don't have justification to think I'm not in Los Angeles, given that I recognize the one entails the other, right? So it might happen that if I didn't recognize the entailment, then I could be justified in believing the one and not justified in believing the other. But what the closure principle says is like, well, when you recognize, when you know, or are justified in believing there is an entailment between the two, how can it be the case or are justified in believing the one, but not justified in believing the other? Right? So it's just like a eminently plausible principle. And the relevant alternatives theorists seems like they have to reject it, because they say, well, it's true that if you have hands, then it follows, it logically follows, that you're not a handless brain in a vat, but that possibility is an irrelevant one. So you can know that you have hands, know that you're having hands entails you're not a handless brain in a vat, and yet not know that you're not a handless brain in a vat. And so that just strikes people as absurd, and sometimes it gets called an abominable conjunction. Something like, well, look, I know I have hands, but I don't know that I'm not a handless brain in a vat. That just sounds kind of absurd. And, so that's, I'd say, one of the main problems for the relevant alternatives theorist. Yeah, but when it comes to contextualism, the contextualists, it seems like they can preserve this kind of principle. The main problem for the contextualists is really just that they're sort of too conciliatory towards the skeptic. So some philosophers are just sort of like uncomfortable with the concession that in the epistemology room, you don't know you're in the epistemology room, right? Or, sorry, when you're in the epistemology classroom, you don't know that you're in the epistemology classroom. And that, as soon as you end up in like the university cafeteria, now you can know that you were in the university classroom. And this seems to be an odd thing, right? Because you can say like, well, earlier it was true that I was in the university classroom, but I didn't know that I was. But now, now that I'm not in that context, I now know that I was in that. I was in that. I was in the classroom. So it just seems to be like a kind of an odd, too conciliatory towards skepticism position for some epistemologist, I guess. But yeah, I mean, perhaps maybe we should back up and say, and we should think a little bit more about, I mean, perhaps these abominable conjunctions, or perhaps giving up this closure principle is something we're willing to do. And so maybe the interesting question here is like, well, what is it that makes an alternative relevant? Because you don't want someone, it's just kind of like a lame response to say to someone like, well, look, I mean, that alternative is irrelevant. That possibility is irrelevant. But then to have nothing to say about, what does it take for an alternative to become relevant? Why is this alternative relevant but not that one? Right. So there's like a good question there, I think.
So we've kind of highlighted a few responses. Is there still a way to solve this paradox? Because Because it seems like every response that we're talking about, right, it still leaves on the table that it's at least still possible, that, we're still in a brain event. So,
Yeah.
yeah, like, is there a way, to solve this paradox, or this is just kind of where we're still left with, after these thousands of years of talking about it?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's like a really great question. Um, a lot of epistemologists are contextualists, but by saying a lot, I just mean something like, I don't know, at least according to the Phil paper survey, it's like a slightly less than half. I think it's like 48% of epistemologists are contextualists. So that means, a little bit more are not contextualists. I would say contextualism and the Morean response, or the neo-Morean response, are like the most popular responses or response types, because within at least even more so within the Morean camp, there's sort of like a variety of responses. So one response, um, which is something that my supervisor Duncan Pritchard has advanced, but also some other philosophers have advanced, like John McDowell, for example. So they sort of argue that our experiences are not as the early modern philosophers thought. So it's not the case that when you have a sensory experience, what's really going on is that you're immediately aware of something in your mind, like a visual impression. They are more, um, I guess you could say, direct or naive realists about the nature of experience. So they think that when you are in a normal case like this one, where you're, say, looking at your hand, um, you really are immediately aware of your hand and not just a visual representation of your hand. And then so they argue like this: well, what sustains the first premise of that Morean argument, that you have a hand, is your direct, immediate visual awareness of your hand. And I go, well, if you're immediately aware of your hand, um, then you are immediately aware of some external physical object, right? You have a kind of justification for thinking that you have a hand, which um, does not leave open the possibility that you're a handless brain in a vat. So they'll say something like, it can't both be the case that I'm immediately aware of my hand and yet I'm a brain in a vat. So they think that that's not really a possibility. And then so the view becomes something like, well, it can't both be the case that we have the kinds of experiences that we think we have, right? Like I say I have an experience as of my hand, but what's the metaphysics of that kind of state? Well, the metaphysics of that state is that I couldn't have that very experience unless I were immediately aware of my hand. So, insofar as I recognize that I have that kind of experience, I can't also say at the same time, well, right now I could be a handless brain in a vat. No, I couldn't be. If I were, then I wouldn't have this kind of experience. I'd have to have I'd have a different kind, namely a hallucinatory kind. And then so you might think, well, yeah, but doesn't that raise the problem again? How do you know your experience isn't a hallucinatory one? But actually, it replaces the problem a bit, because that's really a higher order question, right? It's like, how do you know which experiences you're having? That's different from knowing what your beliefs about the world around you, um, what they're about, and knowing whether they're true, right? So it could be the case that my experiences really do put me in a position to know that there's a hand in front of me, even if I'm not thereby in a position to know what kind of experience I'm having. It could be that it's logically possible that my experience is a hallucinatory one, and I don't know, whether it's a hallucinatory one or a veridical one. But insofar as it is a veridical one, then I do know that I have a hand. I do know that there's external objects. so anyway, I just fleshed out that sort of neo-Morian position just to give you a sense of, one direction some contemporary anti-skeptics have gone.
It kind of
Um,
reminds me, if this is neo-Morian too, like I'm also thinking of like Michael Huemer's response to um, skepticism or just things like that. So like he uses, I think he coined this term like phenomenal conservatism, to where um, when I see like this cup right in front of me, uh, I'm like prima facie justified in believing that unless I have defeaters for this position. So it kind of reminds me a little bit like that, and as a way to respond to this kind of, or at least a form of skepticism, to where it's like, if things appear the way they are in the absence of defeaters, I think that's how he words his principle. If things are the way they are, if this appears to be the case, I'm at least justified until I have defeaters for that position. So at this point, I'm seeing a cup. I'm not I can rule out I'm not hallucinating. Can rule out all these other things. So in that sense, that gives me the justification for believing that there actually is a cup in front of me.
right. Yeah. So, yeah. So this phenomenal conservative position is a form of neo-Morianism. So, um, the other position I talked about is a bit stronger because it's sort of it's saying that in the good case, that is the case where you really are, you know, embodied in an external world, aware of your hands and so on. In that case, this kind of neo-Morian, called a disjunctivist, they say that um, the kind of justification you have to believe that you have a hand is a kind that doesn't leave open the possibility that you're a handless brain in a vat. Whereas the phenomenal conservative, they say that when you are in the good case, or actually either way, whether you're in the good case or the bad case, right? You could also be a brain in a vat. It still seems to you that you have hands, and that seeming, that has some phenomenal force to it. That is, it's something that you should take seriously. You should take seriously at face value, unless there's uh, countervailing reasons to doubt it. And then so they'll say that, well, since it seems to you that you have a hand, you thereby have some degree of justification immediately to believe that you have a hand. But crucially, they don't think that that justification excludes the possibility that you're a brain in a vat. So that would be one of the divides between this first kind of neo-Morian and the more phenomenal conservative neo-Morian. So one says the justification rules out by itself the possibility that you're presently a brain in a vat, whereas the phenomenal conservative, they think that the justification you have for believing that you have a hand, it comes from your experience, but it doesn't rule out the possibility that you're a brain in a vat, because you could also have that same justification even if you were a brain in a vat. And that's something our disjunctivist denies.
So for the disjunctivist position, be would that be question begging to the radical skeptic though, or kind of like, well, I'm having this experience, and this experience is what's ruling out that I'm not in a brain in a vat? Would the radical skeptic conclude that it's question begging? I don't know.
No, absolutely. It's a really good question. So it depends on how it gets framed, right? So you can always frame frame the disjunctivist response so that it's just neo-Morian. Like, I know I have a hand. If I know that, then I know I'm not a brain in a vat. So I know I'm not a brain in a vat. It's the way they defend that first premise. So they say, look, to properly defend the first premise, we need to understand the nature of experience a little bit. So they'll say, look, the skeptic actually has a theory of experience that they're appealing to, and that theory of experience says that you could have the experience of your hand even if you were handless. So generalizing, you could have all the experiences you have now, even if you were a disembodied mind, basically, even if nothing physical existed. And so the disjunctivist takes issue with that theory of experience. So they say, well, it's actually in the nature of experience that when you are aware of some entity, it's a kind of immediate awareness. That is, you're not aware of anything else. You're just aware of, the very thing you think you're aware of. And that thing, that object, is what um, gives your experience the character that it has, right? So when I have an experience of a cup, it's the cup's color, the cup's shape, the cup's texture that gives my experience the character that it has. So put another way, the character of my experience sort of piggybacks on the features of the object I'm aware of. So for that reason, they think that once we properly understand the nature of experience, we can see that it can't be the case that we have the experiences we think we have, and yet we're in one of these radical skeptical scenarios. So they're basically taking issue with the skeptic. They say, well, the skeptic has a false theory of experience,
Okay.
and here's the correct theory. And once you
Mhm.
appreciate the correct theory, you'll see that we can have not only immediate justification to believe our ordinary beliefs, but that this immediate justification is also entails, it
Mm.
excludes the possibility that we're brains and bats, for example. So in a way, it's a kind of infallibilism.
Mhm.
It's a kind of infallibilism because the justification we have, excludes these error possibilities. Whereas for the phenomenal conservative, they have a theory of experience too, and they say that when you're aware of an object, you represent the object, and you represent it in a way where you're not immediately aware of some surrogate, but rather you should think of experience as kind of like belief, where when you believe that it's raining outside, you're not like thereby aware of some surrogate. Belief just doesn't really work that way. And they think that experience is sort of the same kind of phenomenon as belief. The only difference is that um, experience also has a phenomenal character that belief doesn't have. And so really, the phenomenal conservative and the disjunctivist view, you can see them as siblings, right? They're sort of siblings. It's just the phenomenal conservative is saying, well, you can get immediate justification to believe ordinary propositions, but it's not factive justification. It doesn't entail that these radical error possibilities don't obtain. Whereas the disjunctivist is saying, well, actually, once we appreciate the real nature of experience, it gives us a kind of immediate justification, which actually rules out these radical error possibilities.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. Um, and just to kind of recap a little bit, we've mainly been talking about like the paradox of skepticism. We haven't really talked about like the position of that someone's actually putting forward of that we actually are like a brain in a vat or we are in the matrix. And it seems like that one might be, it seems like when that position is, well, okay, this is just what I think. The paradox seems a lot more difficult to like to maybe not argue against, but you need something a little bit more developed as opposed to the actual position of something of if someone is actually taking the stance. And so I kind of wanted to see what you thought. Like when it comes to the stance of radical skepticism, like when we are, in fact, if we are like someone asserting that we are a brain in the vat, that conclusion in itself is a conclusion about something factive. So it kind of seems like you would have like this kind of, I don't know, infinite reguess, or like you could, that wouldn't even be justified either. In order to believe that position, something would have to be justified. And if that position is justified, then at least something is justified on a belief. And that seems to kind of undermine the whole radical position in general. I don't know, like if you have any thoughts on that or.
yeah, definitely. So, yeah, so there are some arguments which target the skeptic as a position rather than as a paradox. So, you don't want to, if you're thinking about the skeptic as a person who has a philosophical position, then the game is a little bit different. Um, Now you can do things like, well, is your view self-undermining? Is there some? Are you committed to some really implausible consequences, then those sorts of responses become relevant. Whereas when we're just dealing with it as a paradox, they're not as relevant. But one response to skepticism qua position, where it's a position, say, that you don't have any knowledge or justified beliefs about the external world, if that's a position one actually held, you could sort of argue that, well, insofar as you're skeptical about the external world, you have to ask, well, why is that? Well, they might go, well, it's because, there's these skeptical hypotheses, for example, like the fact that you could be in the matrix or could be a brain in a vat. And if you were, everything would seem to you to be as they are now. But if that's the case, then how could you really rule that out, right? You could have the very same thoughts and experiences, or so it seems, even if you were in that scenario. So how could you know that you're not in such a scenario? But if that's the way they argue, you can sort of turn that against them and say, like, well, if that applies to our senses, why doesn't it also apply to our memory? Right? So it could be that it seems to you that you remember, waking up this morning, getting breakfast and whatever else. And it might seem to you that you're, recalling something earlier in the day, but you're not. And the problem then is this: it would also apply to the argument, right? So to draw the conclusion of the skeptic's argument, they have to sort of like remember the premises, right? They have to remember that they have to remember what their first premise is, they have to remember what their second premise is, and they have to remember how to deduce conclusion from premises. And then so the problem is like, well, insofar as you can generate a skeptical hypothesis for all of your perceptual, for all your sensory experiences, you can also generate a skeptical hypothesis for all of your memories. But if you can do that, then it's also going to apply to the very reasoning that the skeptical philosopher, the radical skeptical philosopher, is engaging in. And then so it'll be a kind of subversion of their own argument, right? Because they won't have the memorial resources to make use of their premises anymore. So that's one kind of problem. A similar problem has been raised sort of, I think, in 1991 by this philosopher, Chris Ranalli. So he says, like, well, you can create a radical skeptical hypothesis for a priori knowledge. So for stuff that goes on, stuff through thinking alone, just by reflection alone. And so Chris Ranalli says, like, suppose thinking is something like, I don't know, it sort of like aims at truth. And let's suppose that when you're, we can say there's something like accurately thinking that P, or accurately reflecting, a priori reflecting that P, versus merely seeming to do that, but failing. And he goes like, well, you can't distinguish between the two. So how do you know right now that you're actually thinking that P, right? How do you really know right now that you're even considering the premises of a skeptical argument, or you're not just confusing them with merely seeming to do so? And then so that's like another kind of subversion or self-defeat sort of argument that's been given. Yeah. So you can kind of launch these sort of self-defeat arguments against the skeptic, but you might worry that the skeptic is always in a position to say, like, well, I'm sort of appealing to some ideas in order to generate the premises, but once I get the conclusion, I throw away the resources I used to get to my conclusion. So that is, I throw away the resources I used to support my premises. So something like the analogy of using a ladder to climb up a level and then throwing the ladder away. So they might appeal to an analogy like that to try to, get around these subversion, self-defeat worries, but it's not clear it can be successful.
Yeah. All right. You've been more than generous with your time. We're coming up, I think, to almost an hour and a half at this point. Don't want to take too much more of your time. I really appreciate you coming on. And yeah, if you want to kind of have a little bit kind of concluding remarks on kind of radical skepticism.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, no, it's been a really wonderful chatting with you. I would say some takeaways is are that we should think about the kinds of skepticism that epistemologists are interested in as being different from sort of more ordinary ways of using the word skeptic. So the ordinary way of using a skeptic is, someone who's more um, who's standing against pseudoscience and suspicious of supernatural claims and superstition. Whereas in epistemology, it's something like either a philosophical position that a radical philosophical position that a person's arguing for, which says that there's no knowledge or justified belief in this important domain that we care about,
Hmm.
or more often than that, it's a paradox. And since it's a paradox, it's something that any rational thinker can grapple with. And with respect to the radical skeptical paradox we were thinking about, um, they all seem to be sort of intuitively plausible premises. Like you have a hand. If you know you have a hand, then you're not a handless brain in a vat. But you don't know you're not a handless brain in a vat. How do we respond? Well, we have the Morians who kind of affirm common sense. And then we have
Hmm.
these two other more sophisticated views, the relevant alternatives and the contextualist view. And yeah, there's been developments of each one, but still no consensus. And that is how philosophy goes. But um, one thing I hope the listeners can take away from this is trying to uh, see whether or not there's a practical dimension to this kind of skepticism.
Mm.
So, just to sort of end on this note, you can kind of think about um, certain kinds of conspiracy theorists who say things like, well, maybe all political events have been, maybe all of the political events that we're familiar with have been actually caused by something like the Illuminati, right? Or something like the New World Order. And when they bring up that kind of possibility, what they're really doing is raising a kind of skeptical hypothesis, right? A radical skeptical hypothesis, but instead of targeting all external world knowledge, it's targeting all ordinary, non normative political knowledge and belief, right? And then so that's one maybe charitable way of thinking about it, but it raises questions again like, well, are those hypotheses relevant? What kind of evidence would it take to rule them out? Maybe there's transmission failure here. You're like, I can know that, say, the vaccines are effective and that certain politicians are credible, even if I can't rule out these conspiracy theorists' global conspiracy theory hypotheses, right? So I think that there's lots of room, uh, just for us to think about, but also lots of room for more practical application of skepticism and practical application of these anti-skeptical ideas to thinking about more political, practical, conspiratorial forms of skepticism.
Yeah, no, great. That's perfect. And yeah, but yeah, where can people find you? Maybe read some of your work that you've done.
Yeah, sure. So Um, if you just type in my name in Google, hopefully the first website that comes up will be my kind of personal academic website. And in terms of reading things by me, you can look in the Philosopher's Magazine. I have a sort of a popular essay on Wittgenstein, who we sadly didn't get to talk about, but he also has his own very interesting response to skepticism. So I talk about Wittgenstein in Deep Disagreement. Um, I also have some articles, some co-authored articles with Duncan Pritchard about disjunctivism and skepticism. I also have I guess, a fairly recent, very short 1,000 word essay on Moore's proof against idealism and external world uh, skeptics. So if you want to know more about Moore's proof and sort of the contemporary take on it, yeah, you can take a look at that.
All right, sounds good. Once again, thank you for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure.
Yep, same here. Thank you so much.
That concludes another episode of the Reason Through podcast. If you find value in what I'm doing, please consider subscribing, liking, rating, reviewing the podcast as it shows your support, and I would greatly appreciate it. See you next time.